Paul J. Manafort, the former campaign chairman for President Trump. Damon, WinterThe, New York Times, Washington. The indictments of President Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul J. Manafort, and two other former advisors raise the stakes in the special counsel investigation that has dogged his administration for months and could prompt Mr. Trump to consider actions intended to short-circuit the probe before it threatens him or others close to him. The first charges filed by Robert S. Mueller III, the special counsel, indicated that he is proceeding more into his investigation of Mr. Trump's circle. Allies of the president privately raised questions on Monday about whether he might seek to fire Mr. Mueller or pardon Mr. Manafort, while Democrats immediately warned against any such move. The 12 criminal charges against Mr. Manafort and his deputy, Rick Gates, did not bear directly on Mr. Trump, but the 31-page indictment essentially alleged that the president's one-time top lieutenant was secretly a highly paid agent for pro-Russian foreign interests. And a separate indictment of a lower-level advisor detailed extensive efforts to connect the campaign to Russia. Mr. Trump reacted only to Mr. Manafort's indictment, dismissing it because it reflected issues before Paul Manafort was part of the Trump campaign. He wrote on Twitter, adding, "Also, there is no collusion. The president has said nothing about the guilty plea by George Papadopoulos, a former foreign policy advisor, who admitted to investigators that he sought connections with Russian government officials last year to benefit the campaign." Mr. Papadopoulos, who pleaded guilty to making false statements to the FBI, was a relatively minor figure in the Trump campaign compared with Mr. Manafort, but was publicly identified as one of 5 foreign policy advisors to the candidate. He had repeated contacts with an unnamed foreign professor who was an intermediary with the Russians and introduced him to a Russian woman who was described as Putin's niece, referring to President Vladimir V. Putin. The professor told Mr. Papadopoulos that the Russians had dirt on Mr. Trump's opponent, Hillary Clinton, in the form of thousands of emails, during a conversation that took place 3 months before Democratic emails were made public. While the indictment of Mr. Manafort and Mr. Gates did not touch directly on collusion, it made clear that the two were paid tens of millions of dollars over years leading up to the campaign by Ukrainian political leaders allied with Russia, and that their efforts to defraud continued through their time with the campaign until early this year. In the past, the president has signaled that he might dismiss Mr. Mueller if the special counsel exceeded what Mr. Trump considers the mandate of his investigation. Mr. Trump has also publicly noted that he has the complete power to pardon relatives, aides and possibly even himself in response to the special counsel investigation. Democrats quickly warned Mr. Trump on Monday not to impede Mr. Mueller's investigation. The president must not, under any circumstances, interfere with the special counsel's work in any way, said Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, the Democratic minority leader. If he does so, Congress must respond swiftly, unequivocally, and in a bipartisan way to ensure that the investigation continues. Senator Dianne Feinstein, Democrat of California, said the indictment showed that Mr. Mueller is doing his job and that the process was working. "I'll continue to support Bob Mueller as he follows the facts. His independence must remain sacrosanct," she said. Even before the indictment was unsealed, Mr. Trump's supporters argued that it would not mean much if it were focused on Mr. Manafort's private business activities rather than the campaign. This could be a big old nothing burger if it was pre-campaign, but post-campaign it's going to be serious stuff, Representative Sean Duffy, Republican of Wisconsin, said on CNN. He added, "To taint Donald Trump with things Manafort did before the campaign, I think, is a leap too far." Mr. Manafort, a longtime Washington lobbyist and Republican operative, ran Mr. Trump's campaign for several months last year before being dismissed in August 2016 amid questions about his work for Ukraine's disinterested pro-Russian government. Mr. Trump and his aides have since sought to minimize Mr. Manafort's importance to the president, despite reports that Mr. Manafort remained in contact with the White House even after the inauguration in January. In March, Sean Spicer, then the White House press secretary, said Mr. Manafort had only a limited role for a very limited amount of time. In August, after Mr. Manafort's house was searched by the FBI, Mr. Trump said, "He was with a campaign, as you know, for a very short period of time, a relatively short period of time," but the president's political opponents on Monday eagerly distributed a tweet from last year from Sean Hannity, the Fox News host and friend of Mr. Trump's, quoting Newt Gingrich, another Trump ally, boasting of Mr. Manafort's role. "Nobody should underestimate how much Paul Manafort did to really help get this campaign to where it is right now," Mr. Gingrich was quoted saying. Mr. Trump started the morning seeking again to turn attention to the Democrats, as he did over the weekend. In his first tweet of the day, he focused on the firm that helped produce a dossier of salacious allegations against Mr. Trump during last year's campaign and its links to Democrats who helped finance it. Rick Gates left President Trump, Paul J. Manafort, and Ivanka Trump at the Republican National Convention in July 2016. Sam Hodgson for the New York Times reports out that Obama campaign paid $972,000 to Fusion GPS, Mr. Trump wrote. The firm also got $12,400,000 really from DNC. Nobody knows who OKDHE did not mention the fact that the firm that conducted the research for the dossier was originally hired during the Republican primaries by the Washington Free Beacon, a conservative website financed in large part by a prominent Republican donor, the hedge fund billionaire Paul Singer. After Mr. Manafort was brought to an FBI office on Monday morning, Mr. Trump sought again to turn the tables on Democrats. But why aren't crooked Hillary the Dems the focus, he wrote as part of his tweet dismissing the indictment of Mr. Manafort. Democrats said the Manafort indictment made clear how serious Mr. Mueller's investigation has become. After Mr. Trump whipped up a tweet storm of suspicion about Mueller this weekend, he really now has no place to go with this attack, said Robert Bauer, a White House counsel under President Barack Obama. Mueller's first charge is beyond any potential claim of politics or stretching that the president might wish to bring against him and his office. To the extent that Mueller needed any early credibility for his office under hostile fire, this does the job, and then some. Mr. Trump has no public events on his schedule on Monday until 5:45 p.m., when he and the First Lady were due to participate in a Halloween event on the South Lawn. His press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, is scheduled to conduct her daily briefing at 1:15 p.m. Ty Cobb, the White House special counsel focused on the investigation, said last week that the president is not worried about anything that Mr. Manafort or Michael T. Flynn, his former national security advisor, might tell prosecutors about Mr. Trump. The president has no concerns in terms of any impact, as to what happens to them, on his campaign or on the White House, Mr. Cobb told the New York Times. He likes and respects Mr. Manafort and appreciates the work he did for him during the 3 months he was with the campaign. He likes General Flynn personally, but understands that they have their own path with a special counsel, Mr. Cobb added. I think he would be sad for them, as a friend and a former colleague, if the process results in punishment or indictments. But to the extent that that happens, that's beyond his control. Follow Peter Baker on Twitter at PeterBakerNeat.